The first time I saw it, the wind hardly moved the leaves just enough to make the old oak breathe. 20 feet up, cradled where two heavy branches met a sun-bleached bundle clung to the bark like it had grown there, the fabric matted with lichen and the faint glitter of a corroded zipper. Birds had learned to trust it. The forest had learned to forget it. I never could. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Back then, my life moved on bell tones and chalk dust. I taught U.S. history at the high school on McDowell Street, the kind of place where the smell of floor wax hits you in the morning, and the vending machine eats the exact change you don't have to spare. My summers ran on a quiet rhythm, early walks along the French Broad, a cup of diner coffee at the counter a few afternoons with the volunteer search and rescue crew keeping our gear ready in case the mountains called. Asheville in July is a generous sort of hot shoulders warmed by sunshade like a cool hand on the back of your neck. Folks swap the same weather line in the produce aisle. Storm will miss us, and they're usually right. I knew Susan Albright because the town folds people together that way. She worked the church rummage sale every fall, the kind of woman who kept a spare cardigan in her trunk in case anyone got cold. She brags softly, never loud, always gentle about her daughter Julia. I'd hear about Julia's latest design client from the grocery store checkout like it was breaking news. That summer, the news was bigger. Julia was 4 months along, and every sentence had the bright new weight of a child attached to it. Kevin I knew less well, but I'd met him once in a neighbor's backyard where paper plates bent under the weight of potato salad. He had that quick, soft laugh of a person who's comfortable letting other folks tell the stories. A tall guy, lean with the look of someone who relieved his head by getting outside. We talked boots for a few minutes, a subject I can hold my own on, and he listened when I told him to break the new pair in around town before he hit a trail. He took advice the way some people take a glass of water gratefully without show. Asheville kept its small-town manners in those days. Porch lights winked on a little before the sun slipped behind the ridge, and everybody knew which houses left a bowl of water for stray cats. The Blue Ridge Parkway hung above us like a blue ribbon. On weekends, you'd see Subarus and pickup trucks lined up at the trailheads, doors thunking shut, maps shoved into cargo pockets. Pisgah National Forest waited just beyond our errands and routines, so close it felt like a room off the kitchen, a place you step into to cool down and think. In early July, Susan bumped into me in the detergent aisle and said, "They're going to take a last long wander before the baby." She said it with that mix of pride and worry mothers never shake. A loop hike, she told me, something moderate but gorgeous. I nodded like a man who said those words 100 times, check the weather twice, leave an itinerary on the fridge, never underestimate the way fog can close on you like a fist. She knew all that Julia grew up with our church picnics under rhododendron shade, and Kevin had done enough weekend routes to know his knots. They planned it like sensible people do. A week out, I saw Kevin crossing Biltmore Avenue with the telltale brown bag from the outdoor outfitter slung in one hand. He set the bag in the back seat and took a second to tighten a strap on his pack, not because it was loose, but because you can't help it when you're that kind of careful. They'd picked up the practical stuff, fuel canisters, water filters, enough freeze-dried meals to turn boiling water into dinner and relief. At Susan's place, a green dome tent leaned against the hallway like a sentry. 2 sleeping bags, one a rich red one, a deeper blue, lay folded on the couch. Julia held up a tiny onesie she'd tucked into her duffel and laughed the kind of laugh that starts in the eyes. The weather that week showed its good side. Daytime highs around the low 70s, up high nights dropping into the 60s, no thunderstorms ringing the map like landmines. Evenings breathed. The cicadas worked the dark like violinists. It was the mountain answer you hope for when you've got a growing family and one more week to spend a little wild. The night before they planned to leave, I stopped by Susan's with a coil of paracord she'd asked to borrow and a habit of offering one more idea than anyone needs. Julia came to the door, barefoot toenails the soft pink of new eraser's hair, pulled back in a way that made her look both young and sturdy. Kevin stood behind her, cradling a small camp stove like a man admiring a tool he trusted. We talked roots at the kitchen table with paper maps spread open the way you do when you prefer ink and creases to glowing screens. The line they traced with their fingers would take them up from the Daniel Boone Scout Trail, cross a stretch of the Art Loeb Loop, past a few water sources, and drop back to the car a week later. The kind of plan any experienced hiker would nod at and say, "Good choice." I still remember the smell in that kitchen fresh coffee and the lemon oil Susan had rubbed into the cupboards. She leaned her elbows on the table and listened, pride tucked into the corners of her mouth. I could see how much Kevin and Julia enjoyed planning together, finishing each other's sentences without taking ownership of them. Marriage, when it's right, looks like that: shared maps, shared weight, shared quiet. People forget how much of safety is habit. The little rituals matter. Hikers sign logbooks at trail junctions. Neighbors pick up newspapers when someone's away. Teachers like me count students by the rustle of backpacks. Kevin and Julia built their own rituals into the plan. They told Susan they'd call once midweek if they found a ridge with signal, and they'd be back the following Tuesday late afternoon, just in time for a normal supper. No drama to it, just a clean line of days and a return to the same bed. The morning they left, the air felt like clean cotton. I went out early for coffee and saw the light already up in Susan's front room. By the time I drove back, Kevin and Julia were easing their packs into the back of their silver Forester. They moved without hurry. The packs looked well-balanced weight close to the spine, nothing dangling to snag and brush. Julia was in soft gray hiking pants and a blue shirt that brought the color up in her cheeks. Kevin wore khaki shorts, a green shirt, and a brimmed hat that had lived a life before him. Susan hugged them both twice. It wasn't fussing. It was ceremony. When you live in the shadow of ridgelines, you learn to bless departures and wait with grace for returns. I stood with Susan in the driveway as they pulled away, hand-lifted the car's rear window, giving back the reflection of our two faces until it turned the corner. "It's a beautiful day for it," I said. She didn't answer right away, just watched a beat longer, then nodded like she was agreeing not with me, but with the mountains themselves. I left her with the extra coil of cord and a promise to drop by later in the week to swap out the batteries in her porch light. That afternoon, the town moved the way it always did. The line at the hardware store bent around the aisle with folks buying screws and hose washers they'd lose by nightfall. I sharpened a mower blade for Mr. Rowley and rang up a carton of nails for a young couple fixing a fence. The radio gave the weather in that slow local cadence, no warnings, no alerts, just a list of temperatures that sounded like a short prayer. At dusk, I took a walk behind our place where the air is a little cooler and the river throws a soft sound across the grass. Families ate late on their porches. The scent of charcoal carried easy. Overhead, the sky bled into the blue that makes moths drift lazy around porch bulbs. Somewhere off to the south, I imagined Kevin and Julia finding their first campsite, the right balance between water and high ground, between privacy and the comfort of a faint trail nearby. I pictured them laying the green tent fly smooth, each staking a corner, a quiet duet played with cord and canvas. I'll say this about Asheville: it loves a routine. Susan had her evenings that way. A cup of chamomile at 9, a quick look at the old wall calendar. The porch light clicked on with a snap of her thumbnail. That first night, she told me later, she set her phone on the coffee table out of habit, even though we all knew the ridge's swallow signal like it was never there. The clock hand slipped past the hour with no sound but the tick. Nothing to worry over. Not the first night, just how it is when you send people you love into the trees. Midweek approached the way summer weeks do, slow at first, then quick once you're counting. I ran into Susan at Ingalls on Friday morning. She had milk fruit and a jar of pasta sauce in her basket. We talked about everyday things: trash pickup, delays, the high school's new bell schedule, a stubborn porch door that needed a shim. She mentioned she'd set a little bundle aside for the baby, a tradition, she said. One small thing each week. Hope is built like that, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet stocking of a nursery drawer. Out on the Blue Ridge, the weather held. I can still feel those evenings, the relief that slides across your shoulders when the light softens and the day lets go. On Saturday, I drove a few miles of the parkway just to watch the sun pour across layers of mountain like spilled paint. If you don't know the particular spell of late-day ridgelines, it's hard to explain without sounding fanciful. To me, it has always felt like church after the choir's gone home, the walls still humming, the silence lifting rather than settling. Sunday night brought a light breeze and heat lightning so far off you could hardly call it a storm. That's the kind of night hikers sometimes catch a line of bars on their phones, just enough to send a "we're fine" before the signal evaporates. I found myself glancing at the wall phone as I passed the kitchen, an old habit I never broke, even after buying a cell. The house made the sounds old houses make: the soft shift of wood in the night, the low thrum of the refrigerator, a creak like a remembered footstep. Nothing unusual. Nothing at all. I tucked away the coil of paracord for Susan and set aside a spare headlamp battery in a plastic bag, figuring I'd swing by early in the week to do that porch light swap. It's a silly thing, but those little tasks anchor you. You hold the ordinary tight because life usually honors it. Even in the mountains, especially in the mountains, order keeps you steady, a checklist, a return date, a light you switch on without thinking. The last ordinary evening came with crickets. I remember noticing how the neighborhood settled early the way July does when Monday's coming. Across town, Susan left her front window open a crack to let the cooler air ride in, and laid her phone next to her reading glasses on the coffee table. Out on the ridge, night was falling a few minutes earlier than the day before, quarter by quarter. No rush, just the quiet weight of summer doing what it always does. And in our little corner of Asheville, a single porch light clicked on and held steady against the dark, the glass globe humming faintly, waiting for headlights that hadn't turned the bend yet. That light burned later than usual that night. The crickets kept their thin, steady song, and the street stayed empty, patient, as if it understood something we did not. I set the spare battery by the door so I wouldn't forget it in the morning, and stood for a moment at my own window looking out at a road that never lies. It showed me only what was there: pavement shadow, and a space where a familiar set of headlights should have been. I remember that night by the sound first. The crickets outside my window were steady, even a rhythm that usually lulled me to sleep. But that night they felt too loud, like they were filling the space where something else should have been. By then Julia and Kevin were supposed to be heading home. I'd promised Susan I'd stop by to fix her porch light, and she called just as the last light drained out of the sky. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Mark, they're not back yet." It was still early enough for reason. Maybe they'd stopped for a night near the trailhead, where the car battery had died. I told her not to worry, that the forest keeps its own time. But when I hung up, I didn't turn the lights off. I sat by the window a while, watching that empty street and the soft pulse of her porch lamp 3 houses down. The next morning, I drove over to Susan's. The house smelled like coffee and sleeplessness. She'd already called the sheriff's office to ask what to do. They told her to wait one more day, standard procedure. Most hikers come out late, especially on long routes. But I could see in her face that this wasn't a woman who doubted time. She knew the rhythm of her daughter's voice, the pattern of her calls. She would have checked in, she said. I believed her. Around noon, I called a friend at the ranger station. I'd helped with a few searches before lost hunters, an elderly man with dementia who'd wandered off a trailhead. I told him about the couple when they left where they parked. He said he'd check the logs and get back to me. By late afternoon, he called back. The car was still there, a silver Subaru locked, parked exactly where it should have been. Inside, he said, were their wallets, their phones, a bit of spare clothing. I heard my own breath in my ear. That kind of detail narrows the story real quick. It means they meant to come back. It means whatever stopped them happened out there. I told Susan what he told me, and she just sat still, one hand on her coffee mug like it was an anchor. That night, the sheriff's office sent 2 deputies out to the trailhead. They confirmed what the rangers saw, took a few photos, noted the gear left inside, and left the vehicle where it was. I tried to tell myself it was just protocol, that they didn't yet understand the kind of people Kevin and Julia were. Methodical, cautious, the sort who'd check in twice before changing plans. But I did, and that knowledge made the air in the house feel heavy. The next morning, I drove up to the Blue Ridge Parkway with Susan and a deputy who'd been assigned to coordinate with the rangers. The air was sharp with pine and wet soil. When we reached the parking lot, the Subaru sat there like a question mark. I walked a slow circle around it, looking at the details, the way the driver's seat was pushed back, a crumpled gas receipt on the console, the faint outline of boot soles in the dust near the bumper. The deputy opened the door with a spare key Susan had brought. Inside, everything was orderly. No signs of struggle. The cash and cards untouched, phones, dead batteries long gone cold. I remember leaning on the roof of that car and looking up toward the tree line. The forest started just 20 feet away, dense, layered, the kind that swallows light even at noon. The official search began that same afternoon. The first team went up the Daniel Boone Scout Trail, following the same route the couple was supposed to take. 4 rangers with radios, orange vests, and the kind of calm that comes from experience. I stayed near the command post with Susan, watching them disappear one by one into the green. The forest in July has a strange way of silencing sound. It isn't quiet, not exactly, but the noise gets absorbed. You can hear your own pulse if you stand still long enough. When they came back near dark, they'd found nothing. No tent, no prints, no signs of a fire, just empty ground and an endless map of trees. By the second day, the operation expanded. I volunteered to help coordinate with the local search teams. We set up a grid across 30 square miles of rugged terrain. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades pushing heat down into the canopy. The dogs were brought in 4 K9 units, noses sharp but confused by 10 days of summer scent. They caught faint traces here and there, small flickers of human presence, but the lines always broke. You could watch them lift their heads mid-stride, uncertain, then turn back. In the command tent, we traced the map again and again, trying to imagine any direction that made sense. The area wasn't uncharted. It had trails, lookouts, campsites, but none of them offered a reason for a couple to vanish whole. At night, the rangers slept in shifts. Susan stayed in a small camper nearby, refusing to leave until something turned up. I remember sitting with her by a lantern's light, writing out the names of each search sector on paper, crossing them off as they came back clear. It felt mechanical, almost clerical, but it was something to do. Sometimes she'd ask quiet questions. Could they have lost the trail? Maybe got turned around? I wanted to tell her the truth. I felt that people don't vanish without leaving signs, but I couldn't say it. So I told her about the resilience of the human body, about hikers who've survived weeks on foraged berries and stream water. Hope is a language we speak even when it doesn't sound true. On the 5th day, the teams found a campsite near the ridge, old, abandoned, maybe 2 years old. For a brief second, the command radio crackled with energy. But when the photos came back, it was clear wrong gear, wrong setup. Whoever camped there had come long before Kevin and Julia. The disappointment settled heavy. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled through, drenching the forest, turning the soil to dark paste. I stood under the tarp, listening to the rain hit the nylon. Every drop sounded like time slipping further away. Over the next week, interviews replaced fieldwork. Detectives met with every hiker who'd registered on the same week. One, a man from Tennessee, remembered crossing paths with the couple that morning, a brief chat about weather, good spirits, nothing strange. Several others mentioned something less ordinary. An older man, gray beard, camouflage clothes, angry about trespassing. claimed the forest was his land. No weapon shown, just words sharp enough to cut. I remember reading those reports as they came in the ink still wet from the printer. It didn't sound like folklore. It sounded like the kind of trouble that waits for opportunity. The detectives followed that thread to an old ranger named Leonard Milton, fired years back for aggression, living alone on the edge of the forest. They went out, questioned him, looked around his cabin. He let them search, maybe too willingly, and they left with nothing tangible. No blood, no belongings, just the memory of his cold stare. Legally, they couldn't push further. So his name went into a file under person of interest, and that was it. The trail went dark again. By mid-August, the official search was called off. 2 weeks of air sweeps, foot patrols, divers checking creek beds. Nothing. The families kept it going for months after. I joined them when I could, weekends mostly. We covered ground the official maps didn't bother with: steep hollows, hidden ravines, places only locals knew. Every branch scrape felt like an accusation, every silence like a secret. Sometimes we found bits of trash, old tarps, rusted cans, boots too small, but nothing that belonged to them. I came home each time carrying more dirt on my boots and less hope in my chest. The seasons turned. The leaves burned red, then fell. Snow came soft that winter, layering the mountains in white forgiveness. But forgiveness needs a reason, and the forest wasn't giving one. When spring came and the families gathered for a small memorial, Susan held a photograph of Julia and Kevin, the one where they're sitting on a picnic blanket by the river, sunlight washing their faces. She said she dreamed of them often, still hiking, still laughing somewhere out beyond reach. I didn't tell her that I'd started dreaming of the same thing. The mind builds its own versions of survival when it can't face the alternative. Years rolled by. The case shifted from active to archival. New sheriffs came in, new paperwork formats, new computer systems that didn't recognize the old file names. But sometimes when the air turned that certain shade of cool and the mountain light thinned to gold, I'd find myself driving up near the trailhead again. The sign still stood there, Daniel Boone's Scout Trail, and the parking lot still filled with cars from time to time. Hikers came and went just as they always had. Life kept moving even in the shadow of two people who hadn't. In 2012, the courts declared Kevin and Julia legally dead. 10 years is the line where hope meets bureaucracy. Susan signed the papers with a hand that barely trembled, and when it was over she folded her glasses, whispered something I couldn't quite hear, and walked outside into the sunlight. It should have felt like an ending. Instead, it felt like the page of a story that wouldn't turn. By 2015, even the local paper had grown tired of the anniversary articles. A decade had dulled the edges, turned the home's disappearance into a kind of local legend. But legends don't ease the ache, they just make it quieter. I'd stopped trying to make sense of it by then. Some mysteries stay tethered to the earth, buried in roots too deep to dig up. I'd come to accept that this was one of them. Then, one August afternoon, I got a call from the sheriff's office. A voice I didn't recognize said my name, then paused. "Mark, you were involved with the home search back in '05, right?" I said yes. He took a breath. "You might want to come down here. They found something out in Pisgah. You're not going to believe where." That sentence hung in my ear long after the call ended. The summer heat felt different that day, heavier, as if the air itself remembered. Somewhere out in that endless green, the forest had finally decided to give something back. I didn't know it yet, but it was about to tell us a truth that had been waiting quiet and patient for 10 long years. When the call came, it was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of heavy summer day when the air feels thick, even in the shade. I was sitting on my porch reading the paper when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a young deputy named Collins, someone I'd only met in passing at the station. He said they'd found something out in Pisgah deep in the forest about 15 miles off the known trails. His tone wasn't casual, but he wasn't ready to say the words either. I remember him hesitating, choosing each syllable like it might bite back. "Marky said it's about the Holmes case. You might want to come down here." I didn't ask questions. I just felt that cold pull in my stomach, the same one I'd felt 10 years earlier when the Subaru was found locked and waiting. It was the sound of a door I thought had closed swinging open again. By the time I got to the sheriff's office, the light was starting to tilt gold through the blinds. The air in the room was tight with something I hadn't felt there in a long time movement. On the wall above the evidence table, a map of Pisgah spread wide, fresh pushpins marking coordinates I didn't recognize. A ranger I knew from years back, Galloway, now a detective, was leaning over the table with a look that told me this wasn't just another false lead. He didn't waste words. "Hunters found something," he said, "a sleeping bag in a tree, 20 feet up." I blinked, waiting for him to finish. 2 bodies inside. Even hearing it said out loud didn't make it sound possible. 10 years is enough time for memory to harden into a kind of disbelief. I asked where, and he pointed to a spot miles from the Daniel Boone trailhead off the grid. No path, no reason anyone should have been there. It didn't make sense. But none of this had made sense from the beginning. I followed Galloway out to the site the next morning. The forest greeted us with that same smell I'll never forget: wet earth, moss, and something metallic that lives in the bark after rain. The Richardson brothers, 2 locals out scouting for deer stands, waited nearby, hands shoved deep in their pockets, eyes avoiding the tree. From a distance I could see it, the great oak branches reaching wide like it had carried a secret too long. 20 feet up in the fork of those limbs was something unnatural, a shape that didn't belong. The color had faded to the dull gray of old canvas mottled with moss. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you might have thought it was part of the tree itself. The recovery took hours. A ranger climbed up slow using ropes and a harness, careful not to disturb the bark. When he finally reached the fork and secured the bundle, you could hear the strain in his breath as he shifted the weight. It was heavier than it should have been. The ropes creaked as they lowered it down, inch by inch, until it rested on a blue tarp spread beneath. Nobody spoke. The sound of cicadas filled the air like static. When the knife slid through the fabric, the smell that came out was old earth and decay, not fresh death, but the residue of time itself. Bones. 2 sets, tangled together. I didn't need anyone to tell me who they were. 10 years of absence had just turned into presence all at once. I remember Susan's face in my mind at that moment, the way she used to look past me when she talked about Julia, as if seeing something far away, now that something had come home. The site became a crime scene before I could process what I was looking at. Deputies moved quietly, marking off a perimeter with yellow tape, snapping photos, labeling evidence. The air was thick with humidity, heavy enough that even breathing felt like work. I stood off to the side, not part of the official team, but close enough to see the shape of the truth. The bones had been folded in on themselves, as if whoever placed them there had wanted to hide not just bodies, but the idea of them. One of the skulls had a fracture on the back, a clean, deliberate indentation that didn't come from a fall. The other was smaller, more delicate. Forensics packed everything with the precision of ritual. Bark samples, soil, the fragments of fabric still clinging to the sleeping bag's seams, every item tagged and sealed. By dusk, the oak stood bare again, its secret taken away, leaving behind a hollow that seemed almost lighter. But the forest felt wrong now, unsettled, as if it knew we'd taken something it wanted to keep. Back at the lab, the identification came fast. Dental records matched Kevin and Julia. The bones of a small fetus, 16 to 20 weeks, were found among the debris. I couldn't think of words big enough to hold that fact, so I just sat in silence when Galloway told me. His voice cracked once, barely noticeable. They were together, Mark, the whole time. With confirmation came a new kind of urgency. The case that had been cold longer than some detectives' careers was suddenly burning again. Files were pulled from the archive yellowed pages spread out across desks like old confessions. Galloway and I stayed late retracing the steps that had been walked 100 times before this time, with proof that someone had led them off their trail and into that nightmare. We read through everything, the interviews, the grid maps, the old leads that never went anywhere. And then there it was in the middle of a stack of forgotten notes, the reports about the angry hermit. The man who threatened hikers claimed the woods as his own, Leonard Milton. I remembered that name. Back then, the search team had visited him just a formality. He'd let them poke around, probably confident they'd find nothing. They hadn't. But now, looking at the evidence, we had a sleeping bag hoisted 20 feet into a tree, a fracture that only violence could cause. It all looked different. Milton's property sat less than 5 miles from where the Holmeses had vanished. He'd been a forest ranger once years back until he was fired for erratic behavior threats against tourists. Since then, he'd lived alone off the grid in a shack half reclaimed by the woods. He wasn't on anyone's radar anymore, just another ghost among the pines. Galloway stared at the map for a long time, then tapped his finger over that little dot of land. "He's still there," he said quietly. "Has been all along." Within a day, they had a warrant. Probable cause built from old testimony, the proximity, and the newly found bodies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, before the sun came up, I stood beside the convoy of sheriff's vehicles at the mouth of a dirt road so overgrown it barely qualified as one. The air smelled like iron and mildew, the kind of scent that clings to places where time's been forgotten. Galloway adjusted his vest, gave a short nod, and the team moved in. The cabin appeared through the trees like something grown rather than built, wood dark with rot, a roof sagging under moss. No sound came from inside. They knocked, announced themselves, then forced the door. Milton was there, asleep on a cot, gray beard down to his chest, eyes wide but unfazed when they pulled him to his feet. He looked thinner than the last time anyone had seen him, his skin like paper, but his presence filled the small space with something mean and quiet. The search took hours. The inside of that shack was chaos, piles of newspapers, broken jars, rusted tools, the detritus of a man who'd stopped caring. Nothing in there connected him directly to the Holmeses. No blood, no personal items, no traces of a life taken. But behind the cabin stood an old shed, barely standing. I watched as Galloway pried the door open, the hinges crying out. The smell hit first old oil and rot. He pushed aside a stack of tarps, and there it was, a wooden ammunition box. Inside, wrapped in a rag stiff with grease, lay a large hunting knife with a deer antler handle, the blade mottled with dark stains. Next to it, a small pile of notebooks, their pages yellowed and curled. Galloway opened one, the year 2005, written across the front. He flipped through the entries slowly, the handwriting jagged and uneven. At first they were just ramblings, notes about the weather, wildlife, government conspiracies. Then the words changed. 2 came. Guy and girl. Loud. Laughing on my land. Another entry. They stayed. Green tent by the creek. My stomach turned. Page after page grew darker, more deliberate. The last entry made my hands shake when I read it. Met them at night. The rock was stronger. She was carrying a child. Took them up to the big oak. Let the birds eat first. I've seen a lot of bad things in my life, but that line will follow me until I die. The matter-of-fact cruelty of it. The pride. It wasn't just a confession, it was ownership. Back at the station, they put the knife in an evidence bag and brought Milton into an interview room. I watched through the glass. Galloway sat across from him, calm but direct. Milton didn't flinch, didn't ask why he was there. His eyes were still as if he'd already accepted the conversation before it began. Galloway placed the notebook and the knife on the table between them. For a long minute, neither man spoke. Then Galloway started reading slow, deliberate each word from the pages we'd found. When he got to the part about the oak, Milton looked up for the first time. He didn't deny it, didn't ask for a lawyer. He just said they wouldn't leave. This was my home. They laughed at me. The rest of what he said came in that same steady tone, like he was explaining a simple fact of life. He talked about the rock, about tying them, about wanting the forest to take them. No remorse, no hesitation. I could see in Galloway's face that this was the moment the past finally settled. The monster we'd only imagined had been breathing among us all this time, just waiting to be found. When the interview ended, Galloway stepped out of the room and closed the door. He leaned against the wall for a long time, eyes closed, hand pressed to his temple. 10 years, he said softly. 10 years they were right there. The air in that hallway felt strange, heavy, but clean like the forest after a storm. The case wasn't over, not yet. But the silence that had lived in Pisgah for a decade was finally cracking, and somewhere deep inside me I knew the mountains had started to speak again. After that confession, the room felt smaller than I remembered. The walls seemed to breathe with every word he spoke, each sentence flattening the years between what we thought we knew and what had really happened. Leonard Milton sat there like stone hands folded on the table, voice quiet but steady. He didn't ask for water or a cigarette. He didn't shift in his seat. When he spoke, it was as if he was describing the weather, dry, detached, almost clinical. They laughed, he said. Told me this wasn't anyone's land. But it's mine. Been mine since before they came. He looked up, his eyes pale and hollow like two worn river stones. They didn't listen. And then he told us what he did. He waited until night crept up on their camp while they slept and used a rock heavy enough to break both silence and skull. He said it without pride, without shame, just as a fact. Then he said something I've never forgotten. You can't bury what's already part of the woods. You just give it back. When he finished, Galloway closed his notebook and stood. I could tell he wanted to leave the room, but he didn't. He just stood there, letting the weight of that moment settle. Outside the glass, we all stared in silence. 10 years of wondering had ended in 10 minutes of horror. It's strange when you finally find the truth. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like standing in cold water waiting for the numbness to start. That night, the evidence techs cataloged everything from the shed, the knife, the notebooks, the stained rag. The lab worked through the night, pulling what they could. The knife still held traces of blood, though too degraded for a full match. It didn't matter. We had his words written and spoken. We had a confession that matched every detail. No one else could have known the tent, the pregnancy, the oak tree. There was no doubt left. Still, we followed procedure. Every item sealed, logged, and driven to the forensic lab in Raleigh before dawn. The air outside the station was damp, and I remember the sound of cicadas just beginning to stir like the world had decided to wake up while we were still standing in the dark. The next morning, news spread fast. The Asheville Citizen-Times ran a headline before breakfast. Suspect confesses, in 2005, disappearance of local couple. The phones at the sheriff's office rang non-stop. Reporters wanted statements. Television trucks parked on the shoulder outside the building, and cameras flashed every time someone walked through the door. But none of us wanted to talk. There's a kind of sacred quiet that hangs over cases like that. When what's been buried finally surfaces, words feel almost disrespectful. The interrogation was followed by booking. Milton didn't fight. He let them take his fingerprints, his photo, his possessions. When they asked if he wanted to call anyone, he said no. He didn't have anyone to call. His only request was for the return of a pocket knife that had been his father's. It was denied. As he was led to his cell, I watched him go, shoulders slumped but unbroken, the slow shuffle of an old man whose punishment had already begun years before. Within days, the district attorney filed 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was airtight. There'd be no plea bargain. The trial started that winter, and the courthouse felt like a pressure chamber. People who had followed the case for a decade showed up early every morning waiting for a seat. Susan came each day dressed in black, sitting in the same spot behind the prosecution's table. I sat near the back far enough to see the whole room. Galloway took the stand first. He spoke clearly, methodically, walking the jury through the discovery, the sleeping bag, the remains, the oak. When he showed photographs of the notebooks, Susan turned her face away, her hand trembling slightly. Then came the Richardson brothers, the hunters who had found the bundle. One of them, David, described the moment they realized it wasn't trash in that tree. His voice cracked only once when he said, "We thought it was part of the forest. It looked alive." When the prosecutor read Milton's diary entries out loud, the courtroom went dead quiet. You could feel the air thicken. I've been in rooms with silence before, but not that kind. This was something deeper, a silence that carried grief, anger, disbelief. When he reached the line about letting the birds eat first, Susan covered her mouth and wept. The judge paused, gave her a moment, then continued. Even Milton didn't move. He just stared at the floor, hands folded the same way they'd been during his confession. The defense had little to stand on. They claimed mental decline, argued he'd lived too long in isolation, that his mind had warped under solitude. But there was no insanity in his writing. His words were lucid, deliberate, and cruel. The jury saw it too. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, they came back unanimous, guilty on both counts. The sentencing came a week later. The judge, a man I'd known for years, said something that stayed with me. "Mr. Milton," he said, "you confused solitude for ownership, and in doing so, you took lives that were never yours to take." He sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. No one in the room disagreed. Milton didn't react. He stood there, eyes down, until they led him away. When the trial ended, there wasn't applause or closure. People just sat for a long time as if trying to catch their breath. Susan stood slowly, and I walked her outside. The courthouse steps were bright in the winter sun, but the light felt distant pale. She took my arm, steadying herself. "At least, we know," she said softly. Her voice didn't carry anger, just exhaustion. 10 years of waiting had aged her, but she still had that quiet grace about her. She looked up at the sky, eyes narrowing a little. "They can rest now," she said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it yet. The news covered the verdict for days. Reporters framed it as justice served, a cold case finally solved. But for those of us who'd lived with it, it didn't feel like a victory. Justice isn't balance. It's just the closing of a door. The Holmeses' remains were cremated that spring. The family held a small service at a cemetery in Asheville. The morning was clear, the air thin and still. A few of us gathered, old friends, a few search team members, and Galloway, who stood at the back, hat in hand. Susan placed the urn on the ground herself, next to a marker carved with both their names and the date of their disappearance. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The wind through the trees said enough. After the service, I drove out toward the park. The leaves had just started to turn again, gold and rust against the darker evergreens. I parked near the trailhead where their car had once sat. The place looked the same, though everything about it felt different. A ranger's truck idled nearby. He told me they'd left the oak standing, the one where the bodies were found. People called it the Holmes tree now. Some came to leave flowers, others avoided it entirely. I walked part of the old trail, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots. The forest had grown thicker since 2005. The air felt heavy with history, like the mountains had absorbed the story into their roots. I reached a small clearing and stopped. The sound of the wind moving through the branches was the only thing alive out there. I thought about Kevin and Julia, about that morning they'd left laughing their car full of promise. How quickly a moment of peace can turn to something unspeakable. How a single man's madness can stain a place forever. The sun began to drop behind the ridge, turning everything bronze. I stood there for a long time, tracing the horizon with my eyes. Somewhere beyond that line was the oak, older than any of us, still standing tall, its bark scarred with the weight of what it had held. I didn't go to it. Some places once known are better left undisturbed. As I turned to leave, I heard the forest quiet again, the same deep silence I'd felt the first time we searched these woods, the same breath the land seemed to hold before giving up its secrets. Only now it didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like acknowledgement, as if the mountains themselves were saying, "I remember." By the time I got back to my car, dusk had set in. The light faded quick and the air grew cool. I started the engine and sat there a moment, headlights washing over the dirt road ahead. The forest looked calm again, almost peaceful. But I knew better. Some places carry stories that never stop echoing. They just get quieter with time. I looked once more toward the dark line of trees and whispered a quiet goodbye before heading home, not realizing that even after all this, the story hadn't quite finished speaking yet. I think about that tree sometimes. The one deep in Pisgah, the oak that outlasted the horror built into its branches. People still call it the Holmes tree, though there's no marker, no plaque, nothing official about it. The name just settled there like everything else the forest has decided to keep. I haven't gone back since that autumn drive, but I know it's still standing. The rangers said they chose not to cut it down, not out of superstition, but respect. Some places earn their quiet. You don't disturb them any more than you'd disturb a grave. After the trial ended and the reporters left, the town went still in a way I hadn't felt before. It wasn't relief exactly, just an exhale that didn't quite finish. The case was over. The killer was locked away. But peace doesn't arrive with a verdict. It comes slow, if it comes at all. Susan spent that winter in Asheville helping her sister clear out Julia's storage unit, sorting through boxes that hadn't been opened in 10 years. She kept some of Julia's drawings, little pieces of work she'd done for clients and never printed. She told me she framed one a watercolor of a trail winding into mountains and hung it above her kitchen sink. "That's how I see her now," she said, "still walking just further than I can follow." Galloway went back to work after a few weeks, but I could see the weight he carried. He'd been a young officer back when the couple disappeared barely out of academy, and he'd spent half his career waiting for that call. He told me once, months after the trial, that solving it didn't feel like winning. "It's strange," he said. "You get the answer you've been chasing and realize all it really does is draw a line under the loss." He retired the following year, bought a small place up near Brevard, said he wanted to spend his mornings fishing instead of writing reports. Last time I talked to him, he said he still dreams about the woods, only now they're quiet. No radios, no voices calling out names, just wind and water. The sheriff's department archived the case in 2017. The evidence boxes sit on a shelf in a climate-controlled room downtown labeled with numbers instead of names. I've seen them plain, unremarkable things holding what's left of 10 years of searching. A knife, a notebook, a few strands of fabric, the remnants of a sleeping bag. It's strange how something so small can carry so much weight. Every time I walk past that shelf, I think about the gap between the living world and the one those objects came from. It's not big, just the thickness of a cardboard lid, but it holds an entire life's worth of silence. Asheville moved on. It always does. The tourists still fill the Blue Ridge Parkway every summer, same as they did that July when Kevin and Julia vanished. New stores opened, the city grew, and the faces downtown changed. But there are places that hold on to the old stories, The diner off Merriman Avenue where Susan used to sit with her coffee, the church bulletin board that still keeps a faded clipping about the search effort, the trailhead parking lot where the Subaru was found. The rangers say people still leave flowers there sometimes. No one knows who. I've come to believe that remembering isn't the same as mourning. Mourning fades. It has to, or you can't live. But remembering that stays. It's quieter, steadier. It's what keeps the edges from blurring. I see Kevin's face sometimes in photos from that cookout years ago, smiling like a man who hadn't yet learned how dark the world can get. I hear Julia's voice in my head when Susan talks about her light, curious, always trying to see the good in things. I think about how their story became something the mountains carry now, woven into the mist and the moss and the way the trails bend around the light. As for Milton, he's still alive as far as I know, serving 2 life sentences at Central Prison in Raleigh. No parole, no appeal. The guards say he rarely talks, keeps mostly to himself. Spends hours staring out the window of his cell at a patch of sky that probably looks nothing like the one above Pisgah. I doubt he feels regret. Men like him don't understand it. But maybe in the small hours before dawn, when the air is still and the world is quiet, he feels something heavier than thought, the weight of what he took and can never give back. When I think about that case now, I don't think about the crime scene photos or the courtroom testimony. I think about moments, the flicker of Susan's porch light the night they didn't come home, the sound of rain hitting the tarp during the first search, the faces of strangers who volunteered just to look, even when hope had thinned to almost nothing. That's what stays with me. The goodness that keeps showing up in the same world where evil hides. The mountains have taught me something about time. They don't rush to heal. They just endure, letting wind and weather smooth out the sharp edges. People aren't so different. We don't erase the pain. We just grow around it like roots finding a way through stone. 10 years after the Holmes case, Pisgah looks the same, green, endless, beautiful. But if you know where to look, you can still feel the echo of it. It's in the way hikers lower their voices near dusk, in the way rangers pause before they tell new visitors to stay on the trail. It's in the quiet reminder that even paradise needs vigilance. Sometimes I wonder what Kevin and Julia would have been doing now. Maybe raising their child, planning another trip, finding the same peace in the woods that took them. I don't let myself linger there too long. The past has a way of pulling you under if you stare too hard at what never came to be. But I do let myself imagine them resting together at last, beyond fear, beyond waiting. Maybe that's what peace really is. The end of searching. One evening not long ago, I was driving home from town when the sunset hit the mountains just right, the ridges glowing gold, the sky the soft blue you only see after rain. I pulled over on a scenic overlook, rolled down the window, and just listened. The sound of cicadas came faint and steady, the same way it did the summer they vanished. And for a moment, it felt like the whole world held still, not out of grief, but reverence. I thought of Susan then. She once told me she doesn't pray for answers anymore, just for quiet. I think that's what this story has given me too. Not understanding, not closure, just quiet. The kind that lets you breathe without asking why. I started telling this story years later because I didn't want their names to fade. Too many disappearances end without a voice, too many people become statistics. Kevin and Julia deserved better than that. So I tell it slow, the way I remember it, in the hope that someone listening will carry their names a little further. Maybe that's the only justice that lasts, remembrance that refuses to die. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.